Welcome, everyone, to American Girls, the podcast. This is the show where we're reliving the American Girls series book by book, except here on Patreon, where we're doing pretty much whatever you want or we want at any given time. I'm Mary.
I'm still Allison.
And today, Allison, we're coming together to discuss a book that I think this has been recommended to us, and it's definitely been on our list for a while.
This is a book that we have been talking about since we did the Kaya episode. So this has been more than a year in process. We talked about how much we loved reading books such as The Prairie Lotus, which kind of let us look at, American Indigenous history from a totally new, fresh perspective. And today we are reading The Birchbark House, which is by Louise Erdrich. And it was a National Book Award finalist, and it's on just about every list you can imagine for sort of top books to put on a young person's shelf to give them a better view of United States history.
Yeah, completely. This was really a fascinating read, and I'm really excited to get into it. Before we do that, we just wanted to make an announcement about another Patreon activity that we're also very excited about coming up.
Yeah, so we have been talking for a while that we want to keep watch-alongs going. A lot of you joined us for Dick back in June of 2022, and we were kind of going through our 1970s phase. We are going to now move over to like a Streisand, Feldman era by doing a watch-along of the original Funny Girl. And we've been posting polls because we want to make sure that these are at times that you're able to join us. Like, the Discord is great because you can participate in there anyway, anytime, share your cat pictures, your mini pictures, talk about your favorite show. The watch along, we do kind of have to pick a time or a few times to get together to do it. So your feedback really helps us to make it so that as many people who want to participate can come and do that.
Yeah, completely. And I think it's our ambition that we have like a group watch along once a month if we can manage it. So the poll is really helpful to us in kind of figuring out when folks are free. But, as we've said before, the Discord is really everybody's space. So if you want to have your own watch along on that channel, feel free to organize it and, use that space, and we'll certainly join if we can. But we're excited to kind of get into the Funny Girl rewatch, which I have not seen in years and years. So I'm really excited about it.
I have never seen Funny Girl. I don't know the story. And
oh my God, Allison,
I just know the drama.
Yes. You are so in for a treat. I mean, I literally went and rewatched Barbra Streisand's concert in Central Park from around her Funny Girl era. It's like the meteoric rise of Barbra Streisand. It's like she is not a real person. And if for people who have not been on her TikTok, she just joined TikTok, and it's kind of out of pocket, but it's entertaining. Where it's like, I'm sure she has a social media team doing it, but the way that they're curating it is odd. But I've never seen Funny Girl the musical on stage. I've only seen the movie. So it's very, very good. The music is good. Barbra Streisand is just like one of those people, can't be topped, can't be tamed. And, it's I think coming from a place of we are a pro Beanie podcast, or at least, I'll say that I'm sad by what went down there, no matter what was going on behind the scenes. I just think it wasn't cool. So it's nice to kind of pivot to a person that we can all support. So yeah, I'm excited for you to see it, Allison. I didn't realize you hadn't seen the movie.
Nope. And I'll also say that something that I have consumed before that I'm very excited about. So Sammy, who is part of our Discord community, leads the book club, and in September she is going to get people to talk about The Vanishing Half by Britt Bennett, who is now also an American Girl author, and sort of the same pantheon as Val Tripp and others. So that's very exciting, and that is happening early September. So you can check the Discord for all those details, and that's where you'll actually also get a link, and you can make suggestions, right? Like things that you would like to meet up and discuss with other people. Something that's great is if there's something that you've just been really itching to talk about. People are starting to discuss Jeanette McCurdy's book. Just there's a space for you to do that. So you don't have to wait for your once a month episode. That is all right there for you to chat about.
Completely. And if there's a channel that you're dying for that doesn't exist, we do periodic check-ins and ask folks what channels they want, and we create new ones. So, if there's not a space yet for some niche interest of yours, there can be, and there's likely someone else who's also dying for the same conversation topic. So yeah, it's a really great space, and I love hanging out there and kind of like chatting with people about League of Their Own and whatever else. So, but okay, getting into this book, what did you know? Did you know anything about this book coming into it?
Yes and no. So I have heard just, the highest praise and esteem for Birchbark House. And I think the very first place that I encountered this book was in a thread by Anne Helen Peterson, where she was asking the question of, what does it mean to pass on a book series like Little House on the Prairie now? Is that something that people are doing? Is that something that people ought to be doing when it was part of their own life? And that's also where I learned about bloggers like Debbie Reese, who really give a lot of great resources for reading Indigenous literature by Indigenous authors. And so this has been on my to-read book cart pretty much right at the top for over a year, and finally got to read it this week. So I didn't know almost anything about the story, but I knew that it would be set, somewhere on this continent, and it would kind of give us a different type of story from what we'd read in, say, Kaya, right? Which still kind of fits with like an American Girl formula.
Yeah, I similarly didn't really know that much coming into it, other than it was very highly praised to me by people on that Anne Helen Peterson thread and some others. And at my job, I actually was involved in producing a digital anthology project that's going to come out this year, I believe in the next couple of months. And it's a collection of primary sources that people who study literacy have put together from American history. So it's kind of like, if you think about literacy and you're thinking about written texts, traditional texts like letters and whatever else, diaries, these are some other objects in American history that can invite you to think about literacy in a new way. And one of the people that contributed to it is a scholar named Margaret Newton. And she's a scholar who teaches, and this is where I'm really trying to say words correctly, but I keep practicing and I get it wrong. So apologies in advance, any mistakes are mine. She teaches Anishwabenmoon. I don't know if that's correct, but, and she's part of, I think, broadly Ojibwe nation or community. And so she is at University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, and her work is really focusing on what Native American stories from the oral storytelling traditions and from printed texts, like the ones that Louise is drawing on for her book, can tell us about the natural world and specifically climate change. So I was really thinking about that in reading this book. I mean, I know she thinks very highly of Louise's work. I'm going to go ahead and use first name basis as if we know her. Why not? And so that's kind of what I had in the back of my mind coming into this book. But it's striking that this book broadly is kind of like, you could imagine this as a different kind of American Girl book.
Absolutely. There are so many themes in this book that as I was reading, I was like, okay, this is very similar to, some kind of universal experience that we read about in, just almost every character that we've read. Something that kind of sets you on a path to understanding the book and why, the language is complex for someone like me reading it. Is there's a really good kind of preface in the thanks and acknowledgement section where the author, Louise, decides, to kind of describe why does she make certain choices with making this book, and how she's primarily drawing from, for what some people was a spoken language, right? And she talks about how the name of the protagonist, Omikayas, comes from the Turtle Mountain census. And she decides to use a certain kind of spelling and a certain kind of pronunciation because of that. And she says, right on the very first page, I decided to remain true to the name as it was pronounced and spelled in 1892. Reader, when you speak this name out loud, you will be honoring the life of an Ojibwe girl who lived long ago. And so part of what's happening here is this is a book that is about culture clash and colonization. And it's also a book by a person who is saying, upon reflection of that history, these are choices that I have made as an author working with language. So there are definitely going to be times in this episode where I say things incorrectly. We've all had mistakes on this show.
Yeah, and you know what? I think it's more important that we engage with, in a genuine way, with with this culture than any kind of, I think sometimes people are afraid and they hold back then rather than just get in there and we can apologize for any mistakes that we made and just kind of move on. But it's worth it to kind of be exposed to, as you're saying, this really rich culture that she's wanting people to engage with, especially those, I think, who are not members of it. I think it's interesting to think about who is this book for, and I think primarily it's for folks of this culture to participate in passing down, I think, a lot of this tradition, a lot of these stories, as you point to, that she draws on a lot of traditional narratives that are built into the story that maybe she's hoping to pass forward. But I don't think this is a book about Indigenous culture for white people. Like, this is not like a Yellowstone or something like that, or like a literary equivalent.
No, and I think it's a really wonderful book that has, oral traditions pulled into storytelling. It's a book that takes us through seasons of a life, right? And when we think of the basic structure of American Girl stories, we go through about 12 to 18 months with a young person who turns 10 years old. And what's fascinating about this book is we meet Omikayas. We learn that she's called this, or Little Frog, right? Because her first step is a hop, which is just like an absolutely beautiful visual. And we go through a set of seasons with her, and we learn with her who she is, right? Like, we're presented with a kind of origin story at the very beginning, and then we travel with her through a series of events like life, death, sickness, celebration, and we learn with her who she is, where she came from, and we kind of go full circle with a story. So in a lot of ways, there are parts of this that feel really familiar. Like, she is kind of learning how to be a young woman. She's kind of learning how to be part of a community. She's starting to see adults as real people with complexities, which is something that we've all experienced. But there's also a lot of ways in which her life is very different from most of ours, right? Like, the construction and reconstruction of the Birchbark house in the title is kind of a anchor point for how we get through a bunch of seasons with her. So it's a really good story. Like, I think people will enjoy just kind of sitting with it. And I think it's one that when you've gone all the way through the arc, you want to kind of go back to page 1 and read with her again, because she learns something interesting and surprising about herself. And you kind of want to go back and, like, with her, revisit all of that through that prism.
What's really beautiful about this book is that it's introducing you to a different way of being and a different way of knowing. And I think if you're coming from a Western tradition, like, it is sometimes uncomfortable to dip into this kind of storytelling because you're expecting a linear narrative, or at least I was. I think that's just built in because so many of the things we consume are like beginning, middle, end. And this, as you're saying, is it's built around, organized around the seasons. And we start off where we began building the Birchbark house with her grandmother. But between that, you have also all these different ways of interacting that are just kind of quietly built into the book, like how you are in relationship to the natural world. Like, what's really interesting, just to kind of like jump right in, is the first scene of the book. She's with her grandmother preparing to build the Birchbark house, and she goes out with her grandmother to strip bark from a tree, and she starts to, like, her grandmother's like, yeah, that tree, and she starts to hit it with a stick, and her grandmother tells her to stop, and at one point addresses the tree and is like, thank you, like, older sister, like, for giving us your bark so that we can build this house, or I forget the exact quote, but it's really interesting that it's like you have someone on page 1 practically addressing a tree as a person. So it kind of brings up this question of, like, we're in a completely different world where language is inviting us to, like, think about things in different ways. And, like, is a tree a person? Is it a thing? And that kind of, I think, like, unsettles, like, particularly white readers, like, from the jump, to be like, oh, okay, this is not my experience. Like, this is going to be a different worldview.
Yeah, and I'll just read from part of a publisher's summary. There's actually a lot of different summaries that I think kind of really succinctly summarize what goes on in this book. So we learned that this family lives on an island in Lake Superior. And from that summary, though there are growing numbers of white people encroaching on their land, life continues much as it always has. But the satisfying rhythms of their life are shattered when a visitor comes to their lodge one winter night, bringing with him an invisible enemy that will change things forever, and that will eventually lead Omakayas to discover her calling. And what I was not expecting, and what's interesting because I didn't hear it talked about a lot, just in the way that I encountered information about this book. This is a book about the spread of a pox and the spread of disease. And this is like not the first time it's happened to us where, that is just like a part of life that has existed as long as there have been people to spread disease. I kind of had this feeling of here we go again, like we think we're getting away from pandemic or certain kind of illness content, but it's a human universal. So here it is again. And it becomes really, I think, the central thread of the book, which is how those natural rhythms that they have developed or that feel natural to them are totally thrown by the intrusion of a new disease. Or is it a new disease?
Yeah, I think that's definitely a through line, and just in the larger sense, the incursion of white culture. And I think this is where storytelling within the book is really helpful in terms of like documenting or demonstrating how people are trying to process these fears that they have that are very real, of like the threats on their way of life. And where you see that early on is her father is a fur trader, and he's away much of the year, and then he comes back and he's basically like returning and having dinner with the family, and to entertain them they ask for a story, and he tells a story about a river that was hungry for like the people canoeing through like a tough pass. And the way that he survives it is by banging on the inside of his canoe to trick the witches who live under the river into thinking that they've eaten like other people or something so that he can get through. But in the course of this story, he refers to white people as hungry ghosts, and that they just want to consume endlessly, and like nothing seems to be enough. And that kind of becomes a metaphor for the rumors that start to drift into their community about like more white people showing up in their territory, and talks of like pushing the Native community to move further west, potentially to the Dakota territory.
Yeah, and we meet a whole extended family in this book, just kind of coming off a conversation about Rebecca and how wonderful it was to meet so many different people of various ages living under one roof or visiting that roof. We get to meet people in this community, and it actually made me think a little bit about The Witch of Blackbird Pond, because I liked the way that we met adults in this book who were fully formed characters, and how we got to meet them through Omakayas' perspective, right? Like, how does she first perceive this person? And then we as readers are given better exposition and deeper exposition to understand them, right? Like, we're kind of meeting people who are all around this periphery and getting a better understanding of how they fit into the community. I thought that was just like really exceptionally well done. And it's sort of, I think, not inevitable, but it makes sense that as adults we're drawn to some of these adult characters and kind of asking different questions that we might have, like, what are they doing? And there is some just like really extremely well written passages about the father and the way that the father's coming and goings changes everything. And something that I felt would probably be relatable to so many people is there's this passage about the father's return and the way that the easy laughter that this family has shared starts to go away, right? Like that the return of one person who is not always there, who is not part of these rhythms that they've developed, you get this sense that Omakayas and her mother and other people have this like very loving and tender relationship, and his return is disruptive in certain ways. Like they don't laugh as easily as they had. And that's, I think, a real strength of the book. Like just in one page, she makes you feel how much their life is kind of like always a little bit precarious, even though they work so hard to establish these seasonal rhythms.
Yeah, and I think she does a good job of making the characters complicated because when we're first introduced to the dad, she had kind of hints that the main character doesn't want or is afraid of him because he's such a perfectionist. Like he's really driven and demands the most from his team when he's away and then at home. And as you're saying, like it changes the energy when he returns. And yet then he tells a story where, you know, he's kind of charming and you sense that he's heightening certain details to be entertaining. And later when she ends up caring for him when he has smallpox, you do get this moment of tenderness where he calls her by her nickname when she has to like basically hit him in the head with a piece of wood to keep him from going outside when he has a really high fever to make sure he's like, you would go, it was the dead of winter, so he would have frozen if he wandered outside, so she had to keep him inside. And it's kind of this like conflict moment where it's like, am I going to challenge this man who has been introduced as someone she's afraid of? And he ends up being very tender to her and grateful. So it's kind of like no one is just a one note character in this book, and they kind of, people are allowed to change, which I think is interesting. And something else that's cool is like we're with her most of the time. We get access to her internal life. But then there's other times when this storytelling and narrative voice moves to give us like limited views into other character states of mind. So you get this feeling that even though we're with her and she's the main character, it's not like it's only one person's experience that matters the most and kind of like defining the world that we're in, which I think is also an interesting choice.
Yeah, and she's a very perceptive person, right? Like the part where Day Day, the father, has returned, we learn that he even teased old Tallow, but he loved giving her little gifts too. And in the evenings, he told stories until way after the owls began to call. Old Tallow is like a really, I think, important part of this book because she represents sort of another adult in the community who carries a lot of wisdom, has a lot of like direct, fierce feedback, even when it's not necessarily wanted. And that's a good example of how this young person is sort of like reading the way that people react to Old Tallow or interact with Old Tallow as like meaning something greater, right? Like, okay, what's their relationship? How do they relate to each other? Because we might come to this with certain cultural expectations of like, okay, parent-child, that's how that relationship, we might assume something about that. But it's like, how are people treating this other woman in the community who is like a little bit less tethered? Who's able to joke with her? At what points is Omakayas kind of like overwhelmed or intimidated by her? And then really kind of my favorite part of the book, how do they end up kind of bonding, and what does that end up telling us? That's where I really got the kind of like Witch of Blackbird Pond feeling of what's the role of this sort of singular adult in the community who has a lot to offer, and how do people kind of learn from or with that person?
Yeah, and I think an important like distinction between those two worlds is, well, it depends how you define who the Witch of Blackbird Pond is. Is it Elizabeth, or is it the Quaker widow who lives on the outside of town, or in the marsh, who ends up kind of being marginalized in that world because everything's about kind of fitting into the Puritan, worldview. In this book, there's Old Tallow was introduced on page 19 saying she was a rangy woman over 6 feet in height. She was powerful, lean, and lived surrounded by ferocious animals, more wolf than dog, and fiercely devoted to her. So she's described in ways that feel really different from all the other women in her community. It's also said that she has 3 husbands who have just like slipped away from her. No real description of what happened with that, but what's interesting or notable is that even as she has all these maybe characteristics that would make her marginal in The Witch of Blackbird Pond, she is honored for what makes her unique or for her central traits, and she's allowed to be powerful. She's a really successful or like powerful hunter. She trades food for, like meat for meals prepared with it with Omakayas' family, and you can tell that like they're very connected. But I liked in this book that she's not made fun of. She's not put down for the things that make her different. There's like space in this world for someone who's not partnered and who's maybe different.
Yeah, and we do eventually learn, why, at least in one instance, she's not partnered. But Did you find, again, because there are parts of this book where we kind of like move into different topics, did you find yourself sometimes feeling a bit disoriented by the fact that it wasn't always linear? Like, how did you feel kind of as an experience of reading this book?
I think it was different than what I'm used to, only because, as you're saying, most things are patterned after some kind of linear storytelling. In some ways, I think it was helpful to think about this almost as like a meditation. Like, this is meant to be like experienced dislocated from some sense, or it's like kind of against narrative in some ways, or a linear narrative. If you just read like them as discrete moments, you can sort of find interest or enjoyment in the moments as you pass through them. And then I think when you're done with the book, at least my experience, you kind of stand apart from it and are like, oh wow, I see how all of these things were working together. Like, as you read through, it's like it's organized according to season. There's events with the family within each season. And then within each season, there were oral storytelling moments where the grandmother, whose name is Nokomis,
Nokomis, yeah.
Nokomis, and, you know, she shares like these really interesting stories. And then when you're learning about them in the book in real time, sometimes it's like, wait, what does this have to do with anything? And then once you kind of get through that, you're like, oh, this was foreshadowing, or, you know, this connected in this really beautiful way to this other theme.
There are so many times I was like thinking about other stories we've read for children that are, you know, approximately this age, and thinking how distinct this book is, right? And one of the things I kept thinking about, right, was the Kirsten books, and the fact that this author lives in what's present day Minnesota, right? Like, that's where she's based out of, that she speaks many languages, that she's a children's author and an author of books for adults, right? Like, this very proclaimed novelist. And thinking about the way that she chooses to write about written English language. On page 190, we have this really fascinating encounter that includes the grandmother, where the character named Angeline, who's been going to the mission school, they talk about how she's going to learn from priests, comes back and she shares what they call the white man's language, written English. And I love this because Oma Caius is kind of making a joke, and she says, what animal would leave these? Referring to the writing as tracks. And the grandmother steps in and says, be patient. Let's find out what your sister has learned. Angeline says, they're letters. One follows the next. You look at them just like tracks. You read them. They have a meaning and a sound. And thinking about the way that the relationship that Kirsten forges with Indigenous people, we're really only ever given one side of it, right? Because we're given a book from Kirsten's point of view, and we really don't have a sense of like how certain things in Kirsten's world would have been received. I just really liked this page because I think aspects of this book are intentionally disorienting for people who grew up reading English outside of an Indigenous community. And that's powerful in a way that I think the Kaya books like never quite got there.
I think there's a sense here that a lot of things are assumed to be joined together that we would not assume, like a sense of what's sacred with nature, so that even like seemingly small stakes interactions with nature become like carry a greater significance. You get the offerings of tobacco whenever they're going to take something, whether it's maple syrup or sugar, or if it's birch bark for the house or anything. In the, like, the grandmother also says you should leave an offering when you want to hear voices. Like, she encourages her granddaughter to listen to plants talking to her in the forest, because as is revealed later in the book, like, that's what the grandmother experienced when she was being called to her vocation as a healer. And she kind of suspects early on that her granddaughter is being called to the same work, which in fact she is, and by the end of the book she accepts that. But, you know, that's something I think you would not see in, you know, Kirsten's world, or like any kind of description from a white person's perspective. And I think even today, like, there's so many things where from a white person's perspective, like, you don't really get the full picture of Indigenous culture. You miss like these important connections that then end up just making it appropriation. And this is like a stupid comparison, but I'm watching or rewatching The Last Dance, which is this documentary show about Michael Jordan, and Phil Jackson was his coach in Chicago. And there's this moment where they make a big point about how he loves Indigenous culture and how his office was like covered in Indigenous artifacts. And Dennis Robin walked in and was like, oh, I also have like this necklace that a tribe gave to me when I played in, my former team. And I can't remember where that was, where there was a tribe where he was sort of like involved somehow. And it's like, these are people outside of that community trying to describe a community they're not in. And I think it strikes you as off-putting or like this should not be happening. And I never had that feeling, obviously, reading this book.
I also think there's a part of this that, obviously resonates in a very specific way to living through the past few years, which is throughout this book, people around the protagonist are getting sick. And part of the larger journey she's going on is coming into an understanding of herself as someone who likes to both take care of other people and eventually heal other people. And how does she learn to do that? But there's also another piece of this, which is her coming into an awareness of why she's not getting sick, right? Like that she actually has already survived this illness, this pox before, and that's why she's actually able to take care of other people. The way that this book kind of gives us a totally different snapshot of what it might look like to take care of other people or to have, a different cultural frame for immunity. This is not like a fully romanticized story of, a perfect group of people who just naturally in this inherent way take care of each other. What it actually is a story of a girl who ends up living with other people because initially she's abandoned and not cared for when other people around her die. And that the first group of people who are able to rescue her, which is one of the men associated with Yellow Tallow, that he doesn't rescue her, right? And I think you're presented with, as you said, like an extremely complicated picture of this community and the group that she's a part of. It's not this singular note, right? Romanticized, well, and everyone was perfect to each other. No, it's actually a pretty difficult story, and one that I think also gives you a different way of imagining how chaotic it was to have these like different biological interactions, but also the extremely difficult decisions that people felt they had to make. Like Yellow Tallow's partner is not casually making a decision to leave behind a sick girl, right? Who's basically abandoned and alone. He's making what he thinks is the best decision for himself. Yellow Tallow doesn't end up agreeing, but we learn, through an anecdote at the beginning that there is this girl who is sort of lost and alone due to illness, and then we learn that is our protagonist herself, and that's like really something I was not expecting, which I think tells you I didn't actually read anything in depth about this book before going through it, but that was pretty fascinating to me to read after these past few years.
I think with Old Tallow and that whole plot line, and a lot of some of the other plot lines, including Omikaya is taking care of her family with smallpox. Like, what was significant about that to me was how different it read than the Kaya narratives of caretaking. In the Kaya books, I thought it was sort of like inherent that it was her job to take care of everyone else, but I sort of felt like the books were deficient in having enough moments where other characters showed up to take care of her. So it just felt like, she was sort of put upon in ways I didn't think were fair for a child. And in this book, which is largely in like a comparable chronological worldview, you do have these moments of mutual care where she is put under a ton of pressure. A ton is asked of her, particularly almost her entire family, but for her grandmother, gets smallpox. And she's basically ends up caring for almost everybody and doing quite a lot in that. And yet at the same time, she has the youngest brother who's an infant, and he dies from smallpox. And her grief at that loss is related in, I think, a very realistic and a really tragic way. Like she delves into a really deep depression. She can't get out of bed as her family starts to slowly recover. And, there's a scene of like her other brother Pinch, like kind of behaving as he did before. And she feels very dislocated from like a so-called return to reality. And it's at that point that Old Tallow and her grandmother really step up and try to reach her. And I found that that was really beautiful and like a really nice payoff in the book in terms of mutual aid and support that actually echoes the creation narrative that the grandmother shares at one point, that a key figure whose name I may mispronounce, but Nana Bozo in the Ojibwe tradition, there's a story she shares of the creation of the world in which he's like stuck up a tree, like almost water risen up to his nose, and he asks a muskrat basically to go down and get some earth and bring it back to him, and he does, but he dies in the process. And then Nana Bozo makes the world from these pinches of dirt and then brings the muskrat back to life. So it's like even in making the world, there's mutual aid there. Like he has to bring the muskrat back to life, the muskrat gives him the dirt to make the world. And so it's that kind of mutual care that then you see in the book and the way that they treat each other. And I thought that that was really beautiful. And that's something, a key thing that I think was missing from the Kaya books.
Yeah, that's a really cool part of the book. And I will say, like, even if you're just interested in the stories within the story, the way that they're written out, they do kind of pull you out of, like, the main action, right? Because you're asked to pause and to not just follow a linear story. Something I love. Omakayas knew that her Nokomis told her this story for a larger reason than just because she asked for it, right? That's like kind of a cool way to put it. She thought many times of the muskrat diving down, down, down for that little bit of dirt that made the world. She imagined muskrat finally pulling to the very bottom and grasping that bit of earth in its tiny paws. Also, you know, kind of that awareness that you start to come into as you're maturing and coming into an understanding of the world, that whether it's at church, at school, in a conversation with friends or family, that stories can have two meanings, right? That there's like multiple reasons even why the author has included that kind of story. One, it's to educate more people as to, you know, the creation story that's important and part of her culture. Also that it serves as a kind of device in the narrative. But I just loved how kind of naked and laid bare it was. Like, you know, she loves this story because she loves the person telling it. There's a deeper meaning, and the grandmother like wants her to hear something very specific in that telling. That is a really kind of cool part of this book. And again, if you're expecting, you know, sort of like a 6-chapter, 6-book series where someone has a birthday party and all that, like, this is not going to do that for you.
But I do think the foreshadowing here is really powerful. And, you know, like the ways that you have these early moments in the book that then pay off later, like when she encounters the family of bears in the first part of the book, like she's kind of going home from Old Tallow's house and she sees these bear cubs, doesn't see the mama bear, who then pins her to the ground, but she talks to the bear and like basically is listening, and she basically intuits responses from like the baby bears and the mom, doesn't really tell anybody. And then later that foreshadowing comes back when her mother sees her with the same bear cubs later in the next season. They're much bigger, and she's speaking to them and they seem to be understanding her. And it's kind of like this foreshadowing to the end of the book where her mother has shared that with the grandmother, who uses that as an example of like, and here's why I think you might also have a gift for healing, because you have these abilities. And a lot of the abilities come with deep listening, like listening to plants who might be talking to you, or the bear cubs who might be trying to tell you something important about, you know, whatever. And at certain points, it's like she listens when her brother gets his feet burned, her first healing act. She listens to try to remember in her own memory where the grandmother, you know, had the emergency herbs that she travels with, but like tries to listen and remember back, like, how do I use these to heal someone who's been burned? And she ends up treating her brother successfully, and the grandmother's very impressed.
There's the famous Tyra Banks scene in America's Next Top Model where she says, you know, learn something from this. And I think whereas this character learns a lot from those kinds of encounters, I don't think when Kirsten is interacting with like raccoons, bears, and dead people in caves, I'm not sure that there's that same level of learning. That's my speculation.
Yes. And I also don't think in this world it would vibe if somebody was like, hey, I found a dead guy in a cave and he had a ton of pelts that were just like laying around there, and, you know, he's not going to use them. So might as well use this to save our whole family, which is actually kind of like, now that I'm saying that, it's a very, like, if you want to know how these books are different, the way that Kirsten's family meets potential starvation during the winter is like stumbling upon a dead guy whose things they can steal and sell for their own profit. And in this book, the way they deal with it in part is the grandmother has a dream in which a deer reveals where he's going to be waiting for the dad to come kill him so he can be sacrificed for the family. And the dad then takes his chess set and goes and like tricks a white trader into canceling their winter debt and like buying some other needed stuff for the family. So it's not like exploitation. It's like it's a very different way of approaching a similar crisis, I guess.
But also, just the way that you're telling that story, that like these things are actually happening like very much in the same world. Like this is not a different landscape fundamentally from what Kirsten lives in. Like we're talking the same basic area, just two absolutely different sets of understanding the world, interacting with the world. And I don't even think it's just nature, but like the way that people treat each other really couldn't be more divergent. And so to kind of put these two together, because I think that Prairie Lotus is like doing something very different from this book. I don't think that Prairie Lotus is setting out in the same way to really like pull you into an entire worldview the way that this book very successfully does. But putting this next to each other, I think gives you a sense maybe on some like 1/1000th of the culture clash that's happening in that time through colonization.
I think that's definitely true. I haven't read that book. Is that something I should check out after this?
Yeah, so I think Prairie Lotus gives you like a really like beautiful, absolutely wonderful story. And I think it's kind of like if you are trying to break yourself from Little House on the Prairie stories, right? If that was something that you loved in a different season of your life and you're thinking, I don't want to give that exact book for a lot of reasons to young people that I care about, I think Prairie Lotus is like a step in a different direction. Whereas I think if your goal, right, your primary goal is to think about Indigenous history and Indigenous landscapes from a different perspective, like this would be the step. So I don't think it's either or necessarily like an A and then B and then C. But I think for us, it's like we're coming at this where like every sick day as a kid, I watched Little House on the Prairie. So those stories are like part of my consciousness in a way that I'm not going to get rid of easily. Like that is there. That is like part of the experience of how I learned about this part of the world. Where I think books like this represent something really important, and where Debbie Reese and others have said like these need to be on shelves. These need to be things that young people are reading. There's an opportunity when you're talking to folks who didn't grow up with that as part of their like building blocks of understanding to just start somewhere totally different.
Yeah, I think that's definitely true. And it's also kind of like when we were growing up, I don't think anybody would buy a book for like say a friend expecting a child or someone with a young child and be like, okay, what are some children's books that really kind of get at climate change? Like that's just not something I remember growing up reading about, or even hearing like people buying books for kids around. Like it just wasn't on the menu of anything I heard about. And now I feel like that is something in our world where you might want to buy a younger reader, a book that kind of introduces them to a different way of thinking about our relationship to our natural landscape, and not thinking about it purely as, an exploitive one, like what can I get from the land, or even thinking about land as purely something to own. Like I think a really basic different worldview is like much of what it meant to be an American in the early republic was like the dream of owning land. And that's still something that a lot of people dream about. And, there was just a study, I think, that came out that said, a third or a quarter of homes bought since 2020 have been bought by landlords to be rented. So they're not even bought with the intention of being lived in. So, I mean, like thinking about your relationship to property and land as individual ownership is something that's completely dislocated from this book. And also like the fact that you would speak to the environment and give thanks and be conscious of your use and wanting to give back. I think that this would be like part of a tradition of, gifting children's books that invite kids to think about climate change from a young age.
Well, I think there's also some really shrewd passages in here that get at the fact that people in this community, right, including her relative who is going out of her way to learn English, we know, even with the Kirsten books that are written more than a century later, there was historically like not so much an impetus and an effort among white colonists to learn indigenous languages and modes of communication unless it served them. On the other hand, we have this relative who's saying like literally out loud, I don't want us to get cheated in treaties, so we need to be able to like, you know, communicate and level on these terms. I feel pretty certain that I never read anything like that from indigenous perspective written for a child before, right? Like just the kind of bluntness and that awareness of like not only are diseases coming into the community that are changing the way that they live, but this, you know, sense that they absolutely need to be able to communicate, to be able to read, to write, to make sure that they fully understand what people are trying to impose on them. You know, we talk a lot in Rhode Island about the first, you know, predominant colonist, Roger Williams, and the way that he sought to translate local indigenous language. And for a long time, a main way of talking about that was that he was sort of like this, you know, interested scholar, and that he had this desire to be able to communicate. And that's like objectively a partial truth. But the Narragansett perspective is that he was creating the exact playbook to take over what they had, right? That kind of linguistic domination, that was part of something he was doing. So the way that, you know, people who are outside of indigenous communities have talked about this is very different. And this gives people who aren't in those communities living now, getting their education, a chance to see like this isn't just a process that happened unidirectionally, right? You have people who are putting out this idea of manifest destiny and pushing that like zealots, and you have indigenous kids, right, probably 10, 12 years old, who are aware and trying to save their community by learning language.
Yeah, 100%. And I think what's interesting too is like then you get the accounts of early anthropologists, like white anthropologists going into indigenous cultures and like literally colonizing their languages, or trying to like not only force indigenous kids to go and like learn English and assimilate, but then also trying to get transcripts or get keys to indigenous languages to almost like use them against indigenous peoples, or like force translations of the Bible and other texts. So then you get like protective, like efforts to protect indigenous traditions, and, you know, a lot of things like that have then led to attempts to like digitize but also privatize a lot of artifacts and archives in indigenous communities. It's just, yeah, I mean, I think you're right. We've never read anything when we were kids that was from the indigenous perspective of being like, I'm learning English so I won't be taken advantage of in treaties written in English, which is the only reason in this book why people are described as learning English at all. Also interesting that there's no description of like any interest in the missionary work, like in term from a spiritual perspective.
No, it's very much presented as a strategic decision, right? Like listening to the priests will achieve a certain aim, this kind of connection. I feel like, you know, in a way that's distinct from, say, Josefina, right? Where there's like a religious world for Josefina and then a secular world in which there are traders. I feel like there are sort of like outsiders relative to people who are important to the protagonists, and in that orbit, like there are people who are engaged in trade with her father, there are priests, there are different kinds of folks, and they all sort of occupy like a certain category of care and understanding. And then there are the adults who are closer to her, right? Like her grandmother, Yellow Tallow, all these other sorts of people.
Yeah, for sure. And I think, you know, it's also different when you think, kind of returning to an earlier point about like plants or bears as not as like things that could be in conversation with human beings in a literal way. Like a forest is speaking to her at multiple times in this book. Like bears are talking back to her multiple times in this book. It is really powerful. And I just need to say my favorite story in the book, or the one that I found the most haunting, was one of the oral storytelling traditional kind of stories that the grandmother shares about her own grandmother, and how her grandfather was like, never take the boat to the dark side of the lake, and she doesn't understand why. So of course she does it, and she drops some plums over the boat, and basically like her grandmother had passed, and the younger version of her grandmother comes up out of the water and is like basically, yeah, I went down there and I got lost, and I had to stay down there. And her grandfather comes looking for her while this is happening, and as he walks towards the grandmother, like his years fall away, his gray hair returns to its original color, the wrinkles are gone, and he leaves with her in the boat, leaving the grandmother behind, like, like she's telling the story of her childhood. And it was like, wow, like later his like clothes were found by the shore, and it's like, whoa, this is haunting. Like, you don't expect a story like that to be in a children's book. And yeah, so I don't know. I mean, that has stayed with me.
Oh, yeah. And I think there's a lot of passages that like really stick out as just being beautiful. Even like the opening lines, the kind of prologue to this story is the girl from Spirit Island. And the first sentence is, the only person left alive on the island was a baby girl. And of course, in retrospect, it's very obvious that our protagonist is going to be that baby girl, but you don't know that right away. And we are also sort of introduced in a passing way to the fact that the man who sees this baby has a wife who is braver than he is. And we learn that, sometimes, quote, he was amazed at her courage. He grimaced in shame. Unlike him, his wife was afraid of nothing. And so within a few pages, like literally 2 pages, we get introduced to 3 completely dynamic and fascinating characters. And then we kind of go granular, right? And we start to learn about the way that house construction and like different work with trees is seasonal and cyclical, and we get like really deep into the protagonist's world, and we kind of weave in and out. But again, there's so many parts of the book that you may just enjoy reading. I was mentioning off air that I really wish I had listened to this as an audiobook, because I think I would have been less invested in whether I was saying certain words correctly in my own mind, and I could have appreciated that storytelling better.
Yeah, I think this would be an awesome audiobook experience. And there's actually 2 more books in this series. This is a trilogy. So I may end up doing that if I continue. And I heard there's another book called The Roundhouse, which I've not read, which I think is for adults, and it's set on a reservation. I think it's more of a mystery. So I'm interested to kind of check that out. But yeah, I mean, I'm really interested in this writer. I went and watched a couple interviews with her, and it seems like even though this is drawing on a lot of traditional stories, she's worked a lot of her own kind of history in here as well, down to like her own father. Her father was of German descent, and the father in this book is half Ojibwe, half, I think, of European descent or French descent. And so it's interesting to think about like assimilation and how you choose to present yourself to the world. Like, she spoke in an interview with Henry Louis Gates about having to decide whether to enroll as a tribal member as a younger person. And that was really interesting, where her grandfather, who was a member of the tribe, wrote her a letter describing that choice and was like, basically, you can pass in the world, but, you may regret that, or that's, every choice that you might make in this decision comes with its own consequences. Even though the story is set in 1847, I think a lot of it reads like it has issues that could speak to, her own childhood growing up, facing a lot of similar issues.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And it's kind of, interesting. A book set in a totally different time period. It's set like 1990s to basically 2017. I've been reading the much acclaimed book, Olga Dies Dreaming, which I've just been like...
Yeah.
Absolutely really, really enjoying, and it had a similarly like captivating opening page that I just thought was like really funny and cool. And a central conflict in that book is about a young woman who grows up to be a wedding planner for New York coastal elites, and her mother left her when she was younger and her brother to be part of the Young Lords. And so she's from this sort of well-known Puerto Rican family living in Brooklyn, and, all of these kinds of tensions around that. So, part of what I did take away from this book in the end was, sort of the like, I don't want to say funny, like not funny, haha, but like interesting connections between this and something like a Kirsten book, right? Like the prevalence of bears, but also kind of the extent to which like those universal themes, right? Like what happens when someone close to you gets sick, or what happens when someone really close to you passes away from that illness. And the ending of the book, we kind of get a sense that the family has been, not just because of the season, but due to their sadness, it's spelled out that they're kind of in this slumber, and then they start to awaken and they start to rebuild. And I think that makes this might pass the like, should I read this during a pandemic check? I would say yes, because of the way that it's handled. For the same reason that we've decided not to read Fever 1793, as great of a book as I am sure that it is. I think this is a book that might make you feel differently, right? Like it is a book about disease. I know we all just got through like Cecile and Marie Grace, but I think that this is a book that even if you're really kind of feeling those headlines, has enough in it to make you see sickness as part of a larger experience, as opposed to like they're telling me to read a book set in a pandemic. Like I haven't played the board game Pandemic in years now.
Yeah, geez, nor should we, I'm guessing. But I agree. I don't think I could have, once we hit the smallpox plotline, which comes about halfway through this book, I didn't feel like I needed to put it down and like I couldn't handle it, because I think you're introduced to the family, you care about them, you care about her. And I think what's really powerful about this book that is kind of optimistic is that by the end of the book, because it's a circular kind of structure, you're back at the beginning, you're back at the time of like springtime and new life kind of coming through in terms of like them planting and whatever. But also you have this enduring theme of like mutual aid and caretaking that is so affirming. So even when the family reaches like their worst nightmare, they still love each other, they're still showing up for each other, they're trying to support each other as that person needs. And I think that is a really inspiring theme, no matter, the fact that we're still living in this pandemic. My God.
Yeah, and you probably thought there is absolutely no way that they will find a segue between this beautiful book about the 19th century experience of an Indigenous girl and Selma Blair, but buckle up, because that book has some actual thematic connections in the form of her struggle to be a Hollywood starlet with chronic illness. So that's where we're headed next, and there's always a connection if you're willing to look for one, but we've got that one covered. That doesn't mean that we have the rest of the roster for the year planned out. So we love when you give us your suggestions and we're able to take them and kind of run with them. So if you have something that you would absolutely love for us to read, we have some months open. So I'm looking forward to people's sort of, scary or not scary suggestions. And then, of course, we typically do some good holiday stuff. So I'm hoping that people will have some really great ideas.
Definitely. And if you have an idea for, say, like an October or September watch along, maybe one that's Selma Blair themed, those are the kind of suggestions we're always looking for. And I do love hearing people's suggestions because people have really great ideas.
And I'm trying to think, there's so much else going on in the American Girl world, but, by the time this comes out, I hope all of you who were like thrilled about Claudie have her books and her dolls. And if you want to join in on that Vanishing Half book club, I missed the second half of the book. Please feel free to do so, but also just be sure to send us your suggestions. We do read all of your messages on Patreon, and we do have a post up there about how to connect your Discord. So if you are feeling like left out, you don't know how to participate, if I can do the Discord, trust me, you can too. It's one of my favorite like downtime activities. I go to the Calming Circle channel and I go to the Mini Scenes channel, and there is always something fun. So
Allison, if people want to talk to you about Mini Scenes or The Vanishing Half or anything else you might be reading these days, where might they find you?
Yeah, you can find me at Allison Horrocks on Twitter and Instagram. You can also friend me on Goodreads. I love to see what people are reading there. And you and I are both pretty active in the Discord. You can always @us if you want us to see something or reply to something. Mary, where should people find you on Twitter and Instagram?
Yeah, so on Instagram @Mimi Mahoney is probably the best way to be in touch. If you DM me, I will get back to you. It might just take me a minute. Or Twitter @MaryMahoney123, or on the Discord, as Allison said. So any of those places are a great place to reach me. Well, thanks everybody, and we will see you on our next episode.